This incident happened to a relative of mine and his younger cousin and some others. I will call this relative Dave. He and his wife were in their 20s at the time and had not been married very long. Dave had a younger cousin who was being raised by her grandparents. The grandparents lived out in the country, and there was not a lot of kids her age around to hang with, so Dave and his wife would often invite her along if they were driving into the nearest city to see a movie or play mini golf or something like that. It was the cousin's 13th birthday. She wanted to have a sleepover, so it was decided it would be at Dave's house. She invited 5 of her closest friends. Dave and his wife were not all that mature, and when around the kids, they would act like kids right along with them. Anyway, they decided later that night to go to a graveyard, I guess just for a thrill or something. There is not much in our tiny town to do. In our small town, the graveyards around this area are located out in the woods. This particular one was surrounded by thick woods, no houses nearby. It was small and had a chain-link fence around it and a streetlight near the gate where you enter. The caretaker had a streetlight installed at some point, presumably to deter teenagers from going there to drink and party. Well, Dave and his wife and the 6 girls all exited the car and walked around the graveyard and were laughing, joking, chasing each other, telling ghost stories, trying to scare each other, just being silly. They finally got tired of playing around and decided to go back to Dave's house. They all went and got back into Dave's large 70s model car. The girls piled into the back, and of course, he and his wife got into the front. All the females were talking and giggling, being silly, while Dave, sitting in the driver's seat, was getting ready to crank up the car. While this was going on, they heard a tap on the driver's side window. It was not a tap like someone using their knuckles. It was like a ting 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 of someone using a light metal object. Everyone looked toward the window. There was a guy standing there who was holding a machete. The tip of the machete was what he had used to tap on the window with. Dave and his wife said this guy was dressed like Rambo. He was not wearing a shirt, had some kind of rag tied around his head, and was painted up with green and brown paint. Kind of like I guess army guys paint themselves up when they go on maneuvers. Dave assumed it was possibly someone needing help, so he began opening his door to get out and talk to the guy. When he did this, he said, his wife and all the girls started screaming "no" and diving for the door. The girls were diving over the seat and his wife across the seat, etc. They pulled the door shut and locked it and frantically began locking all the doors. Then the girls and Dave's wife all started screaming at Dave, saying, "Go, let's get out of here, hurry up, go," and words to that effect. While he is putting the key in the ignition, this strange guy does this weird sort of like karate move, like you might see on TV. He was spinning the machete around and doing a few kicks. Dave cranked up the car and they took off out of there. Later that night, they rode back to the graveyard to see if he was still there. And of course, this time they had the doors locked and did not get out of the car. They thought they saw someone lying on one of the graves toward the back of the graveyard, but it could have been a trick of the lighting. We don't know to this day who this individual was. I believe he was either on drugs or seriously mentally ill. It creeped all of them out that this very strange guy was probably hiding in the graveyard watching them earlier, when they were walking around out there laughing and having fun, totally oblivious to his presence. This past weekend, my soon-to-be wife Alexia and I had just settled down for a night of movies, pizza, and cuddling. We live in a residential area right outside of town. Our home is situated right across the street from a Presbyterian church with a large cemetery behind it. Most of our neighbors don't own pets, but there's one in particular across the street and downwards a bit who owns perhaps the loudest, most annoying dog to ever exist. Quite an annoyance on a night like tonight, but luckily it was quiet for the entire evening. It's around 10:15 p.m. and we're lying down watching a film in our living room when the loudest dog on earth begins to go off. Unfortunately, there's nothing much we can do, except maybe confront our neighbor or file a noise complaint, but who wants to be the neighbor that does that? After about 5 minutes, I get up off the couch and decide to walk over to our neighbor's home and say something about the dog. As I headed outside and made it to their driveway, unfortunately, I noticed that the neighbor wasn't home. I decided anyway to walk up to the door and ring the bell. After a minute of no one answering, I gave up and headed back towards home. I noticed that Alexia had stepped outside and was looking on towards the direction of the barking. I told her that no one was home and that we should either ignore it or finally file a complaint. No one should have to deal with a loud dog at night, especially if you're trying to unwind after a long day of work or are trying to sleep. Alexia and I head back inside for a bit, and finally after about 10 minutes, the dog ceases to bark. Alexia and I exhaled and laughed a bit before continuing our film. But of course, not long after that, The dog starts up again. This time it sounded vicious. I got up, went outside, and approached our neighbor's fenced-off backyard and saw the dog, who must have heard or saw me coming. It stopped barking, walked up to me, and began to pant in the cute way dogs do. I chuckled and said the dog's name, to which he looked at me and sat down. Such a good animal, even if he's so loud. I then heard something that sounded like somebody walking through leaves coming from behind me and to the right. I turn around to see somebody looking at me from behind a gravestone in the cemetery. The dog must have heard this as well, as it sprung up and began to bark in the direction of the gravestone. I looked on as the person continued staring in my direction, and as the dog continued to bark. I looked towards my house where I saw Alexia standing near her car, looking at me with a confused look on her face. I looked in horror as I saw the person reveal himself from behind the gravestone. His forehead and cheek was stained red with blood, dripping down off of his chin. In his hand was some sort of dagger. The dog began to go ballistic as the person took a few steps in our direction before stopping. I turned to the dog, then back at my home. Alexia, who was still outside, yelled out to me what was wrong. I told her to call the police. She said, "Why the dog?" To which I replied, "He's fucking armed." Probably confused, Alexia went inside to grab her phone as I continued to watch on as the person now began to back off, the dog now going berserk. It was going to take a bit of time for someone to reach our home, so I readied myself to go into self-defense, as I watched the man finally turn around and walk away towards the back of the cemetery and towards the woods. When the police finally arrived, the person was long gone and I was stuck there explaining to a couple of skeptical officers about my encounter. They didn't seem to take me that seriously, but still investigated the area as I explained to Alexia about the person I saw. When the police left after finding no trace of anyone, Alexia and I didn't feel much better. We locked our doors and windows and I decided to call our neighbors to fill them in on everything before heading back to continue our movie night. About 2.5 years ago, I was at my friend's house. There's 4 of us, me, B and D, who are brothers, and T. We're at B and D's house late one night on winter break. We were just having a chill night playing some video games and just hanging out since there was like a foot of snow on the ground, and there's not much to do in the region we live in anyway. We've all always been interested in the afterlife. We have no idea what happens when we die, but it's a subject that really fascinates us. It's fun to think and talk about. The discussion naturally leads to ghosts. Eventually, we decide to go to an isolated graveyard on the outskirts of town to see if it's haunted. 'Cause face it, we didn't have anything better to do. The legend is that everyone who was buried in that cemetery was a gypsy, and there hasn't been any other burials there since 1920, so it's an old semi-abandoned graveyard. Great. We get into my car and drive to the graveyard. At this point, it's around 2 a.m. Let me describe the layout of this graveyard a little bit so it makes sense. It's on a quiet, wooded road with very little traffic and not much light, other than the moon. Going north on the road, the cemetery is on the right side, with a patch of grass on the left side just big enough to fit my tiny car. A car passes in the other lane. I think it was a Jeep. We don't think much of it. It was odd, but we quickly forgot about it, excited to hopefully get the shit scared out of ourselves. We park, briefly think, what the hell are we doing going to an abandoned 130-year-old gypsy graveyard at 2 in the morning? Before getting out of the car and crossing the street to the graveyard. There's a small staircase that leads up to the graveyard. This area is pretty hilly, the whole road is. We climb the stairs, go through the rickety gate and up to the yard. T brought a voice recorder, so him and B head towards the back of the cemetery to try and catch some spirits and whatnot. They're probably around 15 to 20 yards away from me and D. Meanwhile, me and D are just talking, marveling at how creepy this place is, once again questioning why we're here, when we see a set of lights coming up the road. It's the same Jeep. It's a late 90s Jeep and it's white. It parks in the road adjacent to the cemetery, blocking my car. Whoever is in there rolls down the window, blasts some weird satanic-sounding music and stays there. We all freeze. He stays there for probably 30 seconds with creep-ass music playing, but I swear it felt like 30 minutes. This is where we die, I think to myself. And then he drives off. Naturally, you'd think we left after this. However, me and my friends are sometimes, well, stupid. So we ignored it, and went back to looking for something at the graveyard worth seeing. Then the car makes another pass, honking his horn as he flies by. This is where we had the collective oh shit moment, quickly scurried back to my car, and we got stuck. Remember? Tiny car. 1 foot of snow on the ground, parked in the grass. We get unstuck somehow, and I get us on the road, accelerator to the floor. We drive probably about 5 miles, with no sightings of this dude. We think we're finally in the clear. We think we lost him. Suddenly a pair of headlights turn on behind us. He was following us for who knows how long with his lights off, and we had no idea he was there. Suddenly he pulls into the oncoming lane, matches our speed, and drives next to us. He throws something at my car. I still have no idea what it was, but I heard it hit. It didn't leave any dents or scratches, so who knows what it was, and then speeds up and gets in front of us. Far enough ahead so that it looks like he was going to leave us alone. Nope. He slams onto his brakes and slows way down, almost causing an accident. I react fast enough to go around him and get us onto a smaller road closer to town, finally manage to lose him, and we head back to the house, scared shitless. We have no idea what happened that night. Maybe it was just an asshole driver. Maybe it was just teenagers screwing around. Or maybe he was just a psychopath.